very exciting panel that we have planned today on the US-China relations and the TikTok WeChat bans. My name's Isak Antiasari, and I'm going to be moderating the panel today. And we have a very exciting group of panelists that are here to share their expertise on the topic. And I assume that you're here because you have some familiarity with what's going on. But just a couple of quick points. This is broadcasting live on Zoom as well as on Facebook Live. If you have any questions for our panelists, for any one of them, please direct those in the chat, either on Facebook or on Zoom, and we will ask them directly. And just as a second point, Dr. Sheena Grettens is going to need to leave right at 3 Eastern. And so if you have any pressing questions for her, please share them early on so that I can ask those to her. But with that being said, it's my pleasure and honor to introduce each of our panelists. First off is Dr. Sheena Grettens. She's an associate professor at the LBJ School of Public Affairs at UT Austin, where she's affiliated with the Clemens Center for National Security and Strauss Center for International Security and Law. Dr. Grettens' work focuses on authoritarian politics and foreign policy, especially China and in the Korean Peninsula. And she's interested particularly in how these issues affect national security in Asia. Sheena, we welcome you. Second, we have Dr. Sarah Bauerle-Dansman. Sarah is an assistant professor of international studies at Indiana University, Bloomington. She just completed a Council on Foreign Relations International Affairs Fellowship, where she served the U.S. Department of State as a policy advisor and CFIUS case analyst in the Office of Investment Affairs. Dr. Bauerle-Dansman's work focuses on the politics of foreign investment and the nexus of national security and investment. We welcome you, Sarah. And last but not least, we have Dr. Scott Shackelford. Dr. Shackelford is an associate professor of business law and ethics at the Indiana University Kelley School of Business, the Cybersecurity and Risk Management Program Chair, and the Executive Director of the Ostrom Workshop at Indiana University. His research interests include cybersecurity and privacy and the intersection of technology with international law and relations. We are so excited to have all three of you here with us today. So just to start off, I'd like to ask our first question to Sheena. Perhaps you can help us by giving a sort of broad overview of the relationship between these private companies and the state.
Yeah, sure. Well, first, what I want to do is also sort of situate this moment in the U.S.-China competition, because I think that will help us understand why that relationship between the Chinese party state and companies has become so critically important. So we're really in a period of intensifying U.S.-China competition, where the role of technology has emerged as a sort of central point of contention in that relationship, whether we've seen cases about illicit tech transfer and heightened concern and investigations and indictments in the FBI, concern about China's push to write global rules on data security and a data framework that is compatible with Chinese interests and Chinese preferences, or the export of surveillance technology around almost every corner of the contemporary international environment. And so what we're seeing is that the issue of Chinese technology has really come to the fore at a time when the US-China relationship is probably more conflictual than it has been at any period in recent memory. And so into that comes this debate over Chinese companies, how they operate in the United States, whether they adequately protect the data privacy and data security of American citizens, American consumers, and American users. And so The issue with the companies, in this case ByteDance, or some of the other tech companies that have been at the forefront of this discussion, many of these are private companies. And so one question you might really have is, okay, why are we worrying about private companies if we're talking about a competition and tension between governments? And the answer is, at least in part, due to China's legal framework and the political relationship that often exists even between private companies and the party state. So let me explain each of those really briefly. China has passed a whole raft of new national security laws that govern the way that many organizations and companies inside China have to operate, both domestic Chinese entities and foreign organizations or foreign companies. And among those, one of the really important ones is the 2017 National Intelligence Law, which basically obligates any entity in China, regardless of its membership or the nature of the company's structure, to provide information to the Chinese authorities if it's asked to. Right, so the National Intelligence Law gives very broad authority to the party state to request or compel information from an actor in China, whether or not it's public or private. And so that has become one of the key points of issue, is if data from American consumers goes to a Chinese company, the Chinese company has some legal obligation potentially to turn that data over. The second piece, I think, also has to do with the fact that although companies are nominally private, China, the CCP still very much sees itself as trying to set an environment and foster an environment in which companies are still responsive to party direction and party leadership. And in the midst of this, high tension legal drama over the executive order and TikTok, there was actually a directive that came out of China last week talking about how it was really important to make private companies specifically, including tech companies, more responsive to the directives of the CCP and to CCP leadership. So it was really interesting to see the choice to release that statement at exactly the moment when that is a big part of the concern on the American side. So I think that stops there, but if I didn't answer the question, feel free to follow up or
that's tremendous, and thank you so much. Now, there was a recent article that you were quoted in Wired Magazine that basically said that the drama around TikTok and WeChat is, it's a distraction. Do you feel that way, and if so, what do you think that that perhaps we should be zoning in on more?
Yeah, so I remember a little bit about that article, and although I don't think I would use the word distraction, I think the issue here is that the executive order, and any executive order against a particular company, even a really important one like TikTok or WeChat, is a sort of a very specific solution to a much more systemic and structural problem, which has to do with how we think about data security, how we think about data privacy in the United States, and in an environment where technology and data routinely cross borders. And so any one executive order just isn't going to address that. I guess the only other thing I would add to that is that a lot of the focus in the news has been on TikTok because it's very entertaining and its popularity has just shot up in the United States over the course of the last 6 to 10 months. But in some ways, actually, in terms of relations between the US and China, WeChat is a bigger issue. First, because it provides one of the main forms of connectivity for people who have family in China or people in China who have family in the United States to be able to communicate directly, for example, to video chat. And second, because it's almost impossible for an American company to do business in an ordinary way in China without using WeChat and the payment features that WeChat has. And so depending on how the order applies to American companies in China and to various, operations or things that can be done through the WeChat app, the implications for a ban on WeChat may actually be sort of broader and more significant than the ban on TikTok itself.
Thank you so much. And I'd like to encourage all of our listeners and watchers that if you have any questions, there is a Q&A button right at the bottom of your screen. Please feel free to direct any questions to any of our panelists directly there. I want to come back to one of those, to one of the things that you said in a second about the broader U.S.-China relations, particularly around technology. But first, I'd like to ask Sarah, if you could perhaps give a little bit more context on how the U.S. government thinks about national security and foreign-owned firms, and whether you think the current situation is a harbinger for things to come.
Sure, thanks, Isak. And Sheena, a fabulous job kind of laying out there kind of what's going on here, what's at stake more broadly, because I think that, I think many of us, or many of the audience, is really interested particularly in, will I still get to use TikTok? And that's an important question for sure, right? But I think that one of the things that we also need to think about is how the ban on WeChat, the possible ban on TikTok, or whether or not we get some sort of deal that will allow TikTok to continue to operate in the United States, what that means for U.S.-China economic relations and more broadly, just their relations going forward. So in terms of how the U.S. government thinks about national security when it comes to foreign-owned firms. In 2018, the U.S. Congress passed and the president signed into law a new law called FIRRMA, which stands for the Foreign Investment Review. I always forget that second R, but it's basically a change in the structure of what we call CFIUS, or the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. And that committee looks at mergers and acquisitions of foreign firms, or by foreign firms, of US-based businesses. And the committee looks to find if there are national security concerns that arise from that transaction, and if so, what, if anything, the US government should do about it. And so one of the ways that the US government has moved against TikTok, but not against WeChat, because WeChat did not acquire a US-based firm, so CFIUS doesn't apply here, is to review this 2017 transaction in which ByteDance, which owns TikTok, acquired another Chinese company called Musical.ly that at the time had a portion of its business in the US. And because a portion of its business is in the US, the US government therefore had the authority to review the US-based component of that acquisition for national security risks. And this was not filed to the committee in 2017 when the actual transaction took place, but the US government decided later on that there might be a national security concern here, and so CFIUS was going to look at this transaction after the fact. Now, in that FIRRMA legislation, one of the things that it does is it expands sort of the conditions under which CFIUS can review cases. And in particular, it provides the US government with more authority over what are called TID businesses, which stands for critical technology, critical infrastructure, and sensitive personal data. We might think of TikTok as possibly being both a critical technology and a sensitive personal data company, although the boundaries of what is considered a critical technology company are a little bit confusing and I can talk about that more in Q&A if people are interested. So going back to this kind of issue of how do you deal with a situation in which, there are real strong ties between even private firms and a foreign government that maybe you consider to be your adversary. One of the things that the US government is really concerned about when it is reviewing these transactions is if there might be ways that the Chinese government could use access to these troves of US-based persons' sensitive data to, do something with it nefariously. We saw reporting in the news that, that in the previous year, CFIUS had kind of, and this had all been done a lot more quietly, but CFIUS had required a Chinese company to divest its interest in Grindr. And the concerns there is that all of this sensitive personal data that was being collected on the app could be used to blackmail people who were on the app, and in particular US service members, especially because there was sensitive data about their health on that particular app. In the case of TikTok, it might be a little bit harder to understand why kind of a dance app would generate the kind of concerns around that. But TikTok also kind of, there are a lot of children on TikTok under 13. And so that's been a problem in the past, where TikTok has actually been fined for some of the ways that it has kind of not prevented children from engaging on the app in more ways. And there are concerns in particular when companies are collecting data on sensitive groups such as children. But also we know that TikTok is collecting a lot more sensitive data than they've disclosed, and there's been new reporting on just how pervasive that data collection is. But when you read in the news sort of the drama between, the drama going on in terms of if there's actually going to be a deal to save TikTok from being shut down, there's a lot of emphasis on the algorithm and who's going to get to own the algorithm. And one of the reasons for that is because that algorithm is using, is perfecting some AI technology that kind of, it stands at that cusp of it's probably critical technology. The Chinese government has a policy called military civil fusion. And the idea here is that under that policy, the kind of military can basically take all of this technology that has some sort, if it has some sort of military component to it, they can take that technology and use it for their own purposes in ways that is not necessarily the way that it works in the US, where a private company owns the technology. And so part of the thing here that we have to worry about is that in this information technology age, right, it's hard to know where the boundary is between what we might call commercial use and military use. And more of our technology might be what is considered dual use, meaning that it has both a commercial application and a military application. And when that's the case, it's really hard for the US government to figure out, okay, is this a technology that is just, helping people find silly dance videos? Or is this a technology that can eventually help the Chinese government have a really sophisticated weapons system, right? And that's the problem here.
Right. Now, I'd really be interested, and I'm going to come to Scott in a second, particularly around these questions of privacy and security. But I'd like to, something that you said here at the end ties really well with what Sheena was talking about. In the broader context of China-US relations, is there some concern of an increasing technological divide, or are we heading towards, to sort of quote the UN Secretary General yesterday, toward a sort of technological Cold War? Maybe Sheena, would you like to touch on that, or anybody else?
I mean, I can touch on that briefly. I think the issue, and one of the important things that I should have mentioned earlier, is that there are solutions that are available to TikTok because it is possible for it to divest, for the companies to be separated, right? There are solutions or off-ramps that are available there that are not available for WeChat. And so that's also why I mentioned earlier that WeChat may end up ultimately being the more consequential and thorny issue. It's not only the extent of the effect and the type of interconnection it enables, both communication and financial flows. It's also that there isn't an off-ramp for the current tension in the same way for WeChat right now that Sarah was just describing for TikTok. And so I think that's important. As far as what we've seen, we've seen a lot of discussion recently of this idea of decoupling. And I think it's important to remember, first, just to put some historical context on this, and by which I mean like the last even 5 or 10 years, not long history, right? The US and China have never been completely coupled. Right? If you think about financial flows, if you think about, American technology having access to China, it's not like Google and Facebook have free reign in China. So there's always been a sort of process of selective coupling, and the United States has typically been more open than China has. But again, it's been selective across issue area and platform. And so I think the issue here is not so much about sort of, are we going to be coupled or decoupled? We've always been selectively coupled. I think it's impossible to totally decouple given just the interdependence of the global economy. And so the question is really, what kind of selective coupling should we have as international conditions change? And how should those arrangements be structured to protect American national security, which is what the CFIUS process is designed to do, in an age where data security has now become a much more important component of national security. But I guess I just wanted to sort of put in that note of caution about, this big concept decoupling that gets thrown around there, and just to say it's, this isn't a black or white case in most instances. It's not an either or choice.
Sarah, would you like to add anything to that?
No, I think Sheena did a wonderful job laying it all out there.
Now, I was supposed to ask at the beginning, just also because I realized that we're coming up on 3 for Sheena, so I wanted to give you a chance to do your best renegade.
No, thank you. I try to avoid putting sensitive data on any platform. I'm actually not on. I have not been and am not going to be on TikTok.
What about?
It looks like I may have missed my window.
Yeah, it's never too late.
No, I do have to leave in about 5 minutes. But I do want to hear a little bit of what Scott has to say, but I'm also happy to follow up later with questions if anyone has them. So
I will pass on to Scott. So a lot of the early discussions about sort of concerns around TikTok, and I think Sarah touched on some of those, were around privacy, issues of cybersecurity. I think my first question really is that, do you think, number one, that those are sort of valid concerns? And then secondly, do you think that the proposed deal, what type of impact do you think it has on the sort of cybersecurity areas?
Yeah, no, hey, thanks so much for having me. It's an honor and a pleasure, guys. It's a very timely and important conversation, so appreciate the opportunity, to weigh in. Yeah, honestly, echoing a lot of the great sentiments that have been expressed so far. Frankly, I think the Trump administration is kind of cherry picking issues here. There's really not, from what I can glean at least, kind of a strategic pivot that's underway. I think there's political undertones to, frankly, quite a lot of this. When you look at the types of, data, for example, that TikTok is, picking up on users, as many of you are aware, it doesn't look that different from what the likes of, Facebook does, frankly. Now, we can have issues with where that data is going, potentially. And as I just put in the chat box there, there are interesting concerns about data localization and, frankly, the ownership of some of these global companies that this brings it to the fore. So, China, with that publication from their state media, seems to be, frankly, cheerleading us and say, hey, this is a fantastic, global norm. Absolutely, let's head in this direction. To what was just said, in the direction of, frankly, cyber sovereignty, of going, away from this notion of cyberspace being this kind of global network commons, to use former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton's phrase, right? Toward this, if not, a splinter net or a series of digital walled gardens, then certainly a much more regionalized, vision of cyberspace than we've had really since the 80s, quite frankly. And that's going to have profound implications on business, on our society, on human rights, on elections, you name it, right? So I think, frankly, the security and the privacy issues are there, and we should be concerned about them. But I think we should be concerned about them as part of a bigger conversation of, frankly, how much data we're comfortable with these companies, whether they're owned by U.S. firms or frankly German firms, Chinese firms, you name it, that are harvesting and where that's going. So I don't like it being quite so selective with quite so many political undertones. In other words, so. Happy to chat more about that. I love the internet governance piece of all this. That's kind of where I think some of the most fascinating pivot points are right now. But yeah, I'll just stop there for now anyway.
And to give Sheena some last words before you go, would you like to respond to that? Particularly looking at how maybe a data localization strategy might benefit China?
Yeah, I mean, look, the concern in part here in terms of so China has suggested that, oh, well, maybe the proposal, insofar as we understand what was actually agreed to with TikTok, could be a model. In other words, the idea that a company that enters the Chinese market might have to store all of its data in China in order to gain market access is, given the size of the Chinese market, potentially a structure that could play to China's significant advantage, right? Both Chinese companies and the Chinese government. If any foreign firm that is doing business in China has to store data locally, that would be a change from contemporary, business practice, which is much more varied, right? There's some data localization and some that's not. And the other, but at the same time, the Chinese signals on this haven't also been perfectly consistent, right? So yeah, they said it was a model, but then they said, okay, but now we're not sure if, depending on what happens with the algorithm, the Chinese party state might not allow this sale. There have been some pretty negative signals coming from official places in China. The other thing I think it's important to note is that this comes in the context of China's recent proposal for a global data security initiative, which, as Scott mentioned, repeats some of these ideas about cyber sovereignty, which is, quite frankly, fundamentally contradictory in certain places, not everywhere, but in certain places, to this idea of a free and open internet, right? It's very much it's a much more fragmented way of approaching internet governance. I defer to Scott on the implications and the policy options for how we think through internet governance. But I just want to highlight that, the proposal that China has put forward is quite different. And I think there are also some issues with pieces of the Chinese proposal insofar as we understand them to be inconsistent with past Chinese behavior. So, there's this global data security initiative that says, oh, and we also should not collect information on other countries' citizens, except that we know that China has been doing that, right? And so, some of this is a matter of consistency, that whether the Chinese party state is presenting a coherent opinion on TikTok, and we've seen that position evolve a little bit. So I'm not quite sure that they've reached a final verdict on how they feel about what's happening in the United States and this tension with both of these apps. But there's also a question of the consistency between rhetoric and practice, which all governments have to some degree. But it seems like on matters of data security, where some of this stuff is not publicly disclosed, it could be hard to figure out, how to enforce in cases where a country might not have its practices be consistent with its stated policy. Again, I'm really sorry to have to go. This is a fantastic discussion, and I wish I could stay engaged, but thank you all for having me briefly. I appreciate it.
Thank you for being here.
Thanks.
So moving on to and then there were two. I can't get you guys to do the renegade or the say so, but so the question is, what happens next? I guess first, are we going to continue to be able to use TikTok? And then what do you think the further implications are for other companies that might be, in similar situations in the sort of grander scheme of things?
Sarah, feel free if you want to start.
So one thing I wanted to pick up on what something that Scott mentioned there is that, I'm not an expert in cybersecurity law at all. But I do know that from my time at State, this issue of data localization created a huge problem for us and continues to create a huge problem for the US government and our diplomats abroad, and when we are negotiating around these issues, both bilaterally and in multilateral fora. Because the issue is, so for instance, one of the things I did at State is I wrote a cable on kind of best practices for a positive or business-friendly investment environment for our diplomats abroad to use as talking points for when they talk to their counterparts in governments, across the world. And one of the areas that we wrote talking points on was around, IT issues and in particular data security, but as well as not having data localization policies. And so then the US State Department also has a lot of new lines of effort around trying to secure the internet, both in the US and abroad. I'm thinking as well about kind of efforts around Huawei and things like that. And sometimes kind of language around data localization gets inserted in there. And so there is this issue of not just what should US policy be, but how does US policy affect our ability to go out on the world stage, and what is this going to mean for other countries' data policies, and how will that affect the US and kind of just the openness of the internet broadly. And so that is this big tension that the US government still has not really internally resolved, is it's probably not going to work to say we want data localization for us but not for you. And so there's an argument that's being had within the US government itself about how to have a consistent policy in terms of that. Goodness, I talked so long about that I kind of forget what you asked. So I'm going to let Scott take that question, and I'll jump back in if I have anything else to add. And then I guess we probably should get to Q&A.
Yeah, no worries at all. No, that was awesome. No, well done, Sarah. So, I mean, the only thing I would add is, data localization is popping up, frankly, around the world. Since 2017, China has required data localization for its critical information infrastructure. Now, talk about in the eye of the beholder, right? So far, that's been limited to a kind of a narrow subset of operators, but there's no reason that it can apply much more broadly. So I think we're probably, that could even be part of, frankly, the aftermath of all of this, is they'll just widen the types of industries that they require, data localization as being a part of. And as we're talking about, you can see how this degree of data localization pretty quickly undermines, frankly, the business models of some of the big cloud providers, as well as, frankly, some of the big, global internet platforms themselves, right, and how they operate. So that's why this stuff is, frankly, such a big deal. There was a good point that Sheena made as well about this new push toward, cyber sovereignty before she left. And I, especially for this audience, I think it's a really timely point to pay more attention to this, because it's been a couple years since we've been engaged in these types of conversations. We've had too many other, frankly, both real and figurative fires to put out, than spend too much time worrying about, internet governance and cyber sovereignty. But the long story short, this was a process after the Snowden revelations that really came to the fore, 2014, 2015. There were some real concerns back then that we were going to be pivoting away from this multi-stakeholder big tent model of internet governance, where sure, countries get a say, but so do civil society groups, so does academia, so does the private sector, and toward a system that looks, frankly, a lot more like the UN, right, where it's country to country getting the final say over how cyberspace actually looks and functions within their borders. And that debate was never resolved. Basically, there was a series of conferences that gave support to this multi-stakeholder model through 2016. But now with the Trump administration becoming a little less active in these dialogues, there's an opening, frankly, that China's exploiting right now to push its agenda of cyber sovereignty. And with actions like this, like with this TikTok, WeChat ban, frankly, we're just giving more ammunition to those groups who would like to see the global internet community writ large, head in this direction. And especially under a hypothetical, second Trump administration, I think the question is going to be, does the U.S. double down, on this idea of cyber sovereignty in the name of national security, which, as we've already heard, can be used to justify all kinds, of actions? And if so, who's going to step up as the champion of this kind of existing multi-stakeholder status quo that's built on certain core internet freedoms that we think, should apply pretty broadly? Is that going to be Europe? I think it's going to be, time will tell, right? But I think those are the stakes. So among many other things, cyberspace is also on the ballot this November.
Yes. So one of our participants has actually asked a follow-up question to that. They say, do you foresee other U.S. allies placing restrictions or bans on China-based apps the way that India has, for example?
I think this is going to be varied, but I don't see this. I don't see a rush to this. So even in the U.S., there's going to be a lot of litigation around these moves, because the way that the Trump administration went about banning these apps is by issuing an executive order under IEEPA, which is it gives the president the ability to kind of step in using emergency powers when there is an international emergency, like economic emergency. And the administration claims that he has the right to do this because there was a previous executive order from last year around kind of securing information, communication technology, and supply chains. And that this had established that there was a national emergency around this issue. And so this is just kind of a follow-up to that, that emergency order. The problem is that the courts grant the president wide discretion around kind of determining if something is a national security threat or not. But, and there's a big but there, that whenever this pushes up against constitutional rights, then the courts really can step in. And there are huge kind of First Amendment issues here with respect to freedom of speech whenever you start banning apps. And we already see that there have been lawsuits filed against these executive orders for precisely that reason. And we're going to have to wait and see how the courts kind of decide. Of course, we also know that our kind of court system is itself a little up in the air right now. So I guess, as Scott likes to say, there's a lot on the ballot this year. But I think that the US experience kind of relates to a larger experience where even in other countries where there are more restrictions on freedom of speech, kind of the act of banning apps is a huge escalation and raises a lot of questions. And it's probably not the best way in democracies to go about kind of dealing with these issues. So one thing that you could do, which is also really politically challenging, but would fix a lot of these problems in a much kind of cleaner way, is to just enact better privacy laws, right? If you have like better data privacy laws, then this is kind of a moot point, because you wouldn't have the situation of these apps collecting all of this sensitive personal data that they could do something with. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. Anything you want to add, Scott?
Yeah, no, I mean, just briefly, let me get my crystal ball out, right? I think that there probably will wind up being some actions on the part of kind of loosely phrased, Western allies. But I doubt they're going to be focused primarily on TikTok and WeChat. It's probably going to be much more in the realm of, reacting to this new push in the realm of cyber sovereignty, as we've been discussing, and thinking about, what digital privacy and other safeguards the EU in particular should be propounding. As many, I think you guys are aware already, but just in case for the students, if they're not, pretty quickly the EU's General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR, is becoming a bit of a global default when it comes to privacy regulations, including here in the US, right? Because a lot of our companies are doing business and collecting data on European citizens. So they have a lot of regulatory soft power at their disposal, which they're going to be using to help kind of frame this discussion. And I think what's interesting is, even in the last couple of weeks, aside from the whole TikTok and WeChat thing, we've seen some moves on the part of European officials, including the Irish Data Protection Authorities, to start to ban the transfer of data from Irish data centers back to North American data servers for Facebook information, right? So this is basically a challenge now that both what was called Privacy Shield and Safe Harbor, and now what are called these standard contractual clauses. These are basically the ways that US companies can operate in jurisdictions that have more robust privacy safeguards like the EU. This was the way kind of around that through this contractual language. That now is being challenged as well, right? And if that falls away, frankly, legally, there's very few options left to these major US companies that are doing business and collecting data in these jurisdictions. So in other words, not only are we seeing potential walls go up in terms of protecting, these consumers from Chinese products, but also American products, right? And that's going to contribute to this regionalization that we're talking about.
Thank you so much. Another Kevin Keller asked, what are some of the corporate ethical considerations related to building the infrastructure needed to support cyber sovereignty? And can we take any lessons from the Great Firewall? So Scott, you want to take that one first?
Fantastic, right? Yeah. There are a lot of efforts underway, frankly, around the world. There's been a really active dialogue, as you would imagine, between Beijing and Moscow, which are both big proponents of this idea of cyber sovereignty, but come at it from a really different starting point. There is no Great Firewall of Russia the way that there is in China, right? A lot of these services are available, Facebook, you name it, inside Russia. The difference is, instead of trying to block this content, it's just much more heavily monitored, shall we say. So it can be used as a tool as well then to keep track of what's going on and who's organizing and who's talking to who, etc. And Russia's gone so far earlier this year to even create their own domestic version of what's called the domain name system, which is the addressing system of the internet. So now, theoretically, if they are unplugged from the global domain name registry that ICANN runs, which is a nonprofit corporation based in Southern California, for the world domain name system, mind you, they can still operate in cyberspace, right? They can still be a going concern. So in other words, they're finding workarounds, just like in terms of not having so many dollar-denominated transactions to get out of financial sanctions. Now we're seeing similar things play out in the cyber context as well. In terms of kind of corporate social responsibility and the ethical, viewpoints of this, I think it's interesting to note that a lot of these major US tech companies have been pretty dramatic enablers of cyber sovereignty and are actually helping, including repressive governments in the broader Middle East and North Africa as well, to frankly control their rest of populations. There was some wonderful reporting in the New York Times last year that really dug into this. So I think it is right to focus on that. It's right to shine a light on that and to, hopefully, change corporate attitudes there by treating cybersecurity, which I couldn't agree more with, as a matter of corporate social responsibility. That could be a whole separate panel that would be worth having. And then hopefully then, down the road, those kind of soft industry norms might wind up being codified, right? The way we saw in the Green Movement.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Thank you so much. An anonymous user has said, maybe wearing a V for Vendetta mask, I'm not sure, but has mentioned that TikTok hasn't disclosed, rather says, Sarah mentioned that TikTok hasn't disclosed all of the sensitive data that they have access to. What kind of sensitive data is TikTok able to access?
So thank you for the question. The two main things that are probably the most problematic are first the MAC codes. So this, so basically all personal devices have this code that can never be changed that's embedded in the device. and you're not supposed to collect these data because there's no way to opt out, and there's no way, like, basically because you can't change the code at any point. Like, it stays with the device forever. So if that device is sold, like, the next person doesn't have the ability to opt out. And so it is against policies in app stores to collect this information. And it turns out that TikTok was collecting these data for at least 15 months on Android devices. So if you downloaded the TikTok app from an Android device, or installed it on an Android device, TikTok has that information. And there's a lot that can be done with that. And also TikTok had to create a workaround in order to get it, because it was made hard to get, right? So there's also intentionality behind this. Another thing that TikTok did that wasn't clear to users is it was downloading clipboard data that includes things like your passwords to your device and to different apps, as well as things like your credit card information. And this is kind of not standard when you look at other apps as well. And so this was also really problematic. So the thing about TikTok to know is that it's not just gathering data on the app itself, it's gathering data that is on your device more broadly outside of the app. And so, so that is concerning, particularly because the pattern has been that TikTok has not always disclosed how much data they're taking from people. Oftentimes what they're doing is against terms of service, and there's intentionality behind it. And then when it's only discovered, and only when it is discovered does TikTok clean up its act. Additionally, and I don't know enough about this to know if this is a concern or not, so Scott, I'd love it if you have a thought here, but one of the things that I've read that is concerning is others who have done kind of third-party reviews of what TikTok kind of takes have said that TikTok, it double encrypts the data that they take, and this makes it harder for them to figure out exactly what data TikTok has and what data it doesn't have. And they say that this is not industry standard and is kind of odd, but I'm not enough of a cybersecurity expert to know if that's accurate or not.
Scott, is anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, no. So Sarah, yeah, you're absolutely right. In terms of how rare it is, it's relatively rare to do it in the way that they're doing it, but not all encryption, is created equal. So frankly, a lot of it is, it can frankly just be marketing. So like, for example, if you have a really, robust end-to-end encryption scheme set up, including one that's frankly resistant to both AI and kind of quantum techniques, that's worth a lot more than this kind of double encryption that they're touting. So, and frankly, I kind of am more concerned about like whether users of TikTok even frankly know or care much about that nuance. For policymakers, they should know and care, but as we've seen, it's been a bit of an education for a lot of our policymakers to get up to speed, on some of these issues. But I think it's great. We should be more concerned about encouraging encryption. I'm not sure if you guys saw, but earlier today, the Department of Justice came out with some recommendation for changing Section 230, for example, of the Communications Decency Act, which would help hold, social media companies potentially more accountable for the types of activities and the types of posts that are on their networks. That would, of course, apply to other active networks in the U.S., including, TikTok. So worth paying attention to. And that's part of one of the issues here is that, wow, there's a lot of intersecting debates and issues when you start digging into cybersecurity and internet governance at this point, right? Which can be both interesting, like wonderful for students, wonderful for us to discuss, but can also be, from a policy perspective, really tough, because when you touch on this one area, it kind of incorporates this whole host of related debates. with vested interests.
And speaking about that, the sort of intersection of things, one of our viewers has said that TikTok and WeChat bans are actually great because the CEOs are in direct communication with the CCP, and that we shouldn't forget the millions of Uyghur and Tibetan and other minorities in concentration camps. How do you, and I mean, that's a comment, not a question, but how do you sort of react or respond to sort of the broader implications and I think Scott, early on, you talked about the fusing of internet and society and that nexus becoming, less and less clear. How is there anything you might want to say about that?
Yeah, no, I'll be quite brief. Yeah, I don't want my remarks to come off as like flippant or giving a pass, for example, to the likes of TikTok and WeChat, to say nothing of the actions of the CCP in Western China, which are horrific, frankly. And you're right, large segments of both their state-owned economy as well as some of these more loose affiliates, some of which we're talking about now, are frankly complicit in a lot of what's happening there. So from that vantage point, you're right to react immediately to, hey, this is a good thing. We're standing on principles. And my response would be, I would hope that if that's one of the main reasons we're doing this, then we would do it, consistently. And the Trump administration would be speaking with one voice and standing up for these core internet freedoms of an open, secure, interoperable cyberspace that's kind of been the bedrock of U.S. policy for more than 20 years, rather than just cherry picking a few of these topics. And then my other quick reaction would be, yes, but also let's have a broader conversation about how we can encourage, as we've said, more ethical conduct and better CSR across all these different social media companies, not just those active in authoritarian countries.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, I think that is really important. I think that, from a consumer perspective, your choice to be on TikTok, might not seem like you have a choice because everyone seems to have it, right? But to the extent that it seems credible that you being on TikTok is actually kind of contributing to a system that I think that you dislike, then you might want to think also about kind of consumer responsibility of when is it ethical for you yourself to be, participating in this particular app and when you don't want to. Now, I understand that can seem pretty alarmist, because the other side of that is that the more that we, there is something to be said for that. The more that we interact with each other, the more open we are. We're building a world that has based off of cosmopolitan values. Something that, like, at least in the context of TikTok, that makes that argument a bit harder to sustain is that TikTok isn't. You can't be on TikTok in China, right? ByteDance has its own version of TikTok in China called Douyin, and they don't interact with each other, although they are based off of the same algorithm. So if you don't want the Chinese government to have access to your data to train its algorithm to then use in kind of in digital authoritarianism, then you can leave the platform if you'd like.
Right. Thank you so much. And just a reminder, everyone, we have a few more minutes here. So if you have any questions, there's a Q&A tab right at the bottom, or also on Facebook. We will see them and try to get those to our panelists. A question here directly to Sarah. It says, thank you for the explanations on how TikTok may be tied to national security concerns. The possibility of CPC obligates private companies for submission of foreign data, and the military fusion strategy are definitely something to worry about. Do you have examples of these situations? What's what they're saying, that what's in their mind is that there should be some type of presumption of innocence, and asking whether or not the US government can accuse a foreign firm for national security concerns without solid evidence.
Thank you for that question. I don't think anything that I have seen with respect to kind of specific examples of military civil fusion is at the unclassified level. So I don't think I can talk about specific examples here on this particular call. What I would say, oh, excuse me. Sorry about that. Well, I think kind of the question of, isn't there a presumption of innocence? I think that, when it comes, this is the thing that's hard about national security. National security is not just about sort of waiting until a crime is committed and then figuring out who perpetrated the crime and punishing them for it. And in particular, when we're talking about kind of the national security implications of adversaries kind of getting access to specific types of technology, once they have it, like it's out the door, you can't do anything about it. So this type of kind of national security review for, of investments and so forth is really trying to be preemptive. And that creates problems, of course, because you want to make sure that you get the balance right and that we are only blocking transactions that really do need to be blocked, but we're not kind of overzealous in our pursuit of national security. I believe that kind of it is valuable for a host of reasons to have an open economy. And you can't have an open economy without some amount of risk. The issue is kind of getting the balance right in terms of how much risk you're willing to take on. And so, that's, I think, a better way of thinking about it is sort of how much risk is there to this particular transaction as opposed to do we have, credible evidence that this has already occurred. In fact, if it's already occurred, it's no longer a risk. It's a thing that has actually happened, and we're now less safe because of it.
Thank you so much. I have one last question here from Ben, and this sort of looking forward to what we might learn from this situation. Ask specifically if there's any other platforms besides WeChat or TikTok that have similar investments internationally, and is the United States considering restricting more of these platforms, or might we expect more restrictions in the future? Is this setting a precedent for things to come?
Yes, and you're not gonna like it. Sorry to jump in, Scott, but I do know, because it's been reported in the news, that CFIUS has recently sent questions to Epic Games and another gaming company that I forget because I'm not a gamer. But there is Chinese investment, I know, I think Epic is Epic the one that owns Fortnite? Okay, because I know it's Fortnite, and there's another big one. They have Chinese money in them. So just because CFIUS, sent an inquiry to them does not mean that they are necessarily going to be, taken into review and ultimately blocked. The reporting is that CFIUS asked them for information about their data security privacy policies. So if they have good policies there, then I think that, those of you who like to play Fortnite are safe. But it certainly is an issue that will continue to crop up, because so much of these platforms do have money that comes from places of concern for the U.S.
Go ahead, Scott.
That was great. No, I was going to give that same example. So wonderful job, Sarah. And thanks for the great moderating, Isak. This was great.
Thank you very much. So that concludes our panel, because they've said thank you to me. So that's the end. It's all I'm here for. No, but before we conclude, is there anything you guys want to say, sort of by ways of final words? Sarah, you go first.
I'll give Sarah the last word.
Okay, yeah, you go first, Scott.
I'll just express. Yeah, no worries. I'll just briefly express my thanks again. This has been a lot of fun to talk about. These are tough issues. They're complicated issues, but they're really important. And I want you guys to all feel, empowered, who are listening and participating in this conversation today, to join in, right? Because frankly, not only are we talking about how cyberspace looks in 2020 with these types of decisions, these precedents are getting set now. They're going to resonate. They're already resonating around the world. So how we want cyberspace to look in 2030, 2040, I think it should be similar top of mind to even how we're thinking about how to deal with other global collective action problems like climate change, right? Because it's time to bend the curve on a lot of these issues. So we can only do that by working together. Thank you so much. This has been great.
Thank you, Scott. Sarah?
Yeah, it's hard to improve upon that. So I just want to thank everyone who came out to listen to us talk about things that we find very interesting. It's always gratifying when it seems like other people find them interesting and important as well. So thank you all for participating and asking questions. And we hope that this is not, the last time that you'll think about this issue. And of course, feel free to contact me and probably also Professor Shackelford if you have any further questions or follow-up.
Excellent. Thank you all for being here, and be on the look. We have a lot of events very similar that are always on the HLS events page. And so with that, we will say goodbye. Thank you for tuning in, and hopefully we'll see you next time. Thank you both to both of our panelists and to Dr. Sheena as well. This was fantastic.